The following presentation will briefly overview each chapter as I endeavour to explain my understanding of particular aspects of the social context of education and how these might impact on educators. In Chapter 5, on social class and inequality, we were exampled with 4 pillars. These were identified as education, social stratification, inequality, and productive pedagogies. In each of these areas, we were guided through the historical and theoretical models which ground these in education through sociology. Looking at Marxism, we understood ideas of capital and class which ultimately define the way in which the education sector runs in Australia today. We understand merit versus class alongside the socio-economic status of individuals and the intersection and interaction of these. Capital ultimately defines cultures of power and an individual's level of access in education, where opportunity is dependent on the educational codes instructed by past and current policy and practice. While majority of Australians tend to perceive our society as classless, objective and subjective measures of social class are still very much present. Class identifiers like occupation and education have lasting effects on Australians. This undoubtedly stems from the distant ripples of colonisation, which prolonged an intergenerational social structure of mobility, social cohesion, social capital, and an entrenched disadvantage, increased socio-economic inequality. This has ultimately influenced how Australian social class is measured and analysed, including designing indices of occupational prestige and determining educational inequalities. Social class in this sense can then be understood chiefly through social stratification, which is defined as the division of people based on their social position. Class has been dominant in critically engaging the way young people function within educational and work settings. This understanding is characterised by the stereotypes which are dependent on their social context. It appears that regardless of the post-colonial assumption that Australia is meritocratic in its ways, there is a social disparity evident through the maintenance of social privilege. This social privilege tends to dismiss Australia's old adage of being the country of a fair go, and education appears then to be the crux of social privilege in Australia. It appears Australia is in need because the reproduction of social inequality, or rather the persistence of social privilege, affects a range of different equity groups. These inequalities are undermined by policy and practice and display a complete lack of commitment to combat the perpetuation through institutions and the education sector. For educators, this means that theory and practice are paramount in understanding social and cultural contexts. Our role as educators is vital, as we are able to prevent the reproduction of both advantages and disadvantages that have plagued the education system, for example, the imparting of inapt cultural resources, and the symbolic and heavy value placed on qualification. Inequalities are not only reproduced through physical difference, but are products of living, embodied levels of subjective emotional experience and practice. Social capital is often employed to mask and sustain institutional social positions, limiting access for certain groups, or those that are considered working class or low socio-economic. The system has ceased to change as a result of a lack of social capital accessibility from the appropriate networks. This is because of a resistance from dominant groups to effectively change system accessibility. Social capital in this sense is relational. So it is of the most importance that we as pre-service teachers begin to utilise and harness social capital as a resource to increase and improve outcomes and opportunities, in particular for working class students. In Chapter 6, on cultural difference and identity, we were again presented with 4 grounding factors: multiculturalism, education, culture and identity, each of which were explored as extensions of each other. Multiculturalism as cultural diversity along with the policies that promote it, identity as multifaceted identification of an individual along with the complexity of globalisation and national identity, culture as considerations about the value and importance to a particular group, their heritage and cultural transmission, migration, assimilation and of course the Darwinist view, which ultimately ends in discrimination, racism and inequality, were also discussed. Other concepts like monolingualism, the promotion of a single language, often occurs at the cost of linguistic diversity, which tends to roadblock the flourishing of multiculturalism and identity formation in Australian education, which is seen through English-dominant schools throughout the country. How identity is determined through the curriculum includes the work of contexts and requires a strong understanding of what it means to be human. When establishing identity, educators should uphold the concept of curriculum as experience. Since the inception of the Melbourne Declaration of Educational Goals for Young Australians, there has been increasing new demands and a changed context, which tends to reinforce the justification for the content of the Australian curriculum. Fueled by a modernist liberal optimism, it is derived ultimately from identity as the immediate material context. Young Australians are defined by the relativeness of their physical and geographical contexts, alongside their socio-cultural, economic and historic variables, or their material identity. Australian students are encouraged to accept a framework defined by current political, social, economic, scientific and technological parameters as the means by which they ought to establish their identity and worldview. This often occurs without consideration or in direct opposition with their natural identity, and only reinforces the assumptions that what is good for the culture will be sanctioned through curriculum. These categories direct identity to predetermined values and attitudes, an idealised lived experience for the next generation of young Australians. Power in education rests in the hands of the policymakers who we can safely assume received higher rates of both social and cultural capital through their parental occupational prestige during their youth. Educational institutions attempt to overcome these problems, yet there is a lack of engagement and collaboration from most parties. So it appears that often schools run on the assumptions, expectations and stereotypes of the socially privileged powerhouses that dictate where they spend their little money. Underfunded schools means a lack of resources, not just for the Australian-born students, but for those seeking refuge from their war-torn countries. Cultural assumptions are seen in this sense as the social glue, yet in that claim rests a capacity to form social control, which reduces learners to a mere commodity. The understanding of human capital establishes the individual as a commodity, but one to be invested in, as this investment will provide some sort of dividend when they are older and an active employable member of the community. The state, or in this case the department, attempts to invest in educating individuals as a commodity so they might produce an adult that contributes to economic growth. The role of the individual child is then to participate in the curriculum, learn new knowledge and succeed. If this does not occur, it is the child's fault for not fully engaging. This type of individualism infers that social construction, along with the circulation of power, runs through the patriarchal discourse controlled by the child. In Chapter 8 on gender, we were exposed to both the biological and socio-cultural understandings. Firstly, we understand gender from its biological standpoint of sex, that is, the physicality of either male or female. Then from its socio-cultural standpoint, gender through its social context as a lived experience. This perspective is strengthened through feminist materialist views like feminism and Marxism. As we delve a little deeper, we understand gender as a social construct from gender patterns through choice and sexuality. Ideas of femininity and masculinity expose both the similarities and differences and give rise to inequalities which opt for difference over sameness. Choice and sexuality form identity and gender and display an outward expression of a person's most inner essence. This context in which gender rests sidelines a person's lived experience and social constructs. In education, we understand gender in its biological form, where teachers are privy to resistance to trends while attempting to move beyond the constraints of gender stereotypes. Since the feminism of the 1970s, women have been on a continuous journey of empowerment, which has peaked now at a point where female students don't feel or act like feminists because they see opportunities which were once denied to women as nothing special, as they are simply a natural and normal part of their daily lives in and outside of the classroom. Females are breaking through gendered stereotypical conventions in much success. You only have to look at STEM for an example of this. There is considerable attention given to time allocated for females to pursue curriculum pathways in those areas. Females are also the targets of intense self-esteem and resilience programs, so they may deal with gender inequalities or inequities if they ever encounter them. But what about our boys? It appears that this type of education thrust upon our female students has continued to impose sexual constructions of masculinity on our male students, impacting not only on the perception of body image but their sense of self. This indeed raises concern, as while we have been able to challenge the objectification of females by males, there's been a gap and a lack of vigilance in addressing female objectification of males. Is that not the perfect example of gender double standards? The antagonistic style of gender politics tends to win out in this sense, which means many of our boys remain outsiders here. Males understand and bear witness to an array of gender contradictions, yet feel a lack of empowerment to do anything about it. It is our role as educators to empower our kids, regardless of their gender. When we can create neutral, safe, trustworthy, respectful and open environments, we will also create equitable ones. We should challenge proposed gender conventions and advocate for those who need it most. If we want to operate as 21st century educators in a 21st century environment, we need to look at ourselves as progressive, seeking to challenge these inequities and inequalities of gender stereotyping. We therefore need to ensure our attention is aptly balanced. Failing to do so will only further perpetuate the continued pitting of one gender against another. We need to shape our pedagogies around particular images of our students and ourselves as educators. Our interest in these types of discourses are also held in the policy and relations of the power that enable it. This will mean that we will need to navigate and negotiate our ways of practice. Much like the neoliberal regime of truth depends on discourse of human capital, rights, freedom and choice, it also constitutes avenues towards inclusion, diversity and clear space for gender equity. For Australian teachers, education is mostly contextualised by national regulation, policy and quality, whereby human capital of the individual is made from their natural or potential attributes, which may in the future benefit the nation. These ideas are realised by strong individual identity. Research has shown that children are very aware of their gender and understand it in powerful ways, and they use this to negotiate their learning and their relationships. This asks educators to foreground their questions of the distribution of power through the meanings of gender, along with ethnicity and sexuality. Educators are in the best position to gather significant information about the influences of gender, feminism and experience. We are to work with gender in the same way that we would learners who are considered culturally and linguistically diverse. We should make thoughtful and meaningful pedagogical decisions when selecting materials, equipment and resources. We are implored to critically engage, to become reflective practitioners and assist our students in becoming natural learners in that they can explore their role as human while developing the skills necessary for living in society. In so saying, we don't need to complicate their already complicated minds with adult biased gender perceptions. As we examine each of these topics, it becomes difficult to speak of one without the other. It would appear as if these social contexts are multifaceted and interconnected, which I guess is the whole point. To push further and label this idea, we adopt the term often used by Webb: intersection. Intersectionality sheds light on how social and cultural inequalities are not only interrelated, but are bound together to influence the educational system operating within society. When concerned with inequality, intersectionality is supreme, helping to explore the dynamics of power. Appealing to categories of identity, which establish multiple axes, while eliciting complex and multi-layered narratives which are rooted across social and cultural contexts. Intersectionality in this instance is the culmination of gender, race, and other categories of difference, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies. Social identities, power, and inequality cannot be separated into categories. It simply perpetuates the inequity of inadequate models manufactured through political and economic policy and practice. Conceptualizations like these try to engage the complex social contexts and inequalities within educational institutions. In so doing, they often expose the inconsistencies and tendencies which highlight the differences and similarities within institution policy practice, which shows a close interplay of identity formation. Intersectionality is a lens in which we analyse social class practice, specifically in terms of how ethnicity and gender interact and overlap, producing distinguished experiences and outcomes for students. The study of identity then becomes a reflexive and complex process. A person's identity alongside their social position are seen as processes of becoming rather than being. It's not who we are or where we came from as what we might become or how we represent. Perhaps it is our roots over our roots. Gender is always lived in the modalities of ethnicity and class, nationality in the modalities of gender and race, and class in the modalities of gender and nationality. It is our role as pre-service teachers to embed this type of thinking into our philosophy and mould it into our pedagogical practices. Someone once told me that next to your parents, your teachers are the most influential adults in your life. It's important we don't take that for granted. We're at the forefront of change and creating a more equitable society, not just for young Australians, but for all Australians. We need to support their strengths, interests, needs, and readiness with a focus on individual identity. Student-centred curriculum and student-centred pedagogies allow for the production of an external gaze which can govern teaching. We are at times set back by our need to categorise, surveil and authorise how and what students learn, limiting their explorations. Through treating students like this as social units of education, we only perpetuate these inequities when we should be challenging them. It is our role as pre-service teachers to embed this type of thinking into our philosophy and mould it into our pedagogical practices. Someone once told me that next to your parents, your teachers are the most influential adults in your life. It's important we don't take that for granted. We're at the forefront of change and creating a more equitable society, not just for young Australians, but for all Australians. We need to support their strengths, interests, needs, and readiness with a focus on individual identity. Student-centred curriculum and student-centred pedagogies allow for the production of an external gaze which can govern teaching. We are at times set back by our need to categorise, surveil and authorise how and what students learn, limiting their explorations. Through treating students like this as social units of education, we only perpetuate these inequities when we should be challenging them. We should refrain from forcing diversity into a set of categories where equal rights and choice simply locate responsibility for social disadvantage. As teachers, it is paramount that we question the silence, gaps, and unintended aspects of pedagogy and delve into a constructive discourse which practices understanding in both learning and teaching.